This is the legend of a man named Nicholas. Born in Tbilisi, Georgia, and having grown up in Budapest, Hungary, Nicholas had early immersion in music. Taking piano lessons at an early age, Nicholas would quickly improve and polish his skill in musical performance. It wasn't long until Nicholas would complete his undergraduate studies in music in Budapest, Vienna, and Florence, and eventually pursue a master's at Juilliard and a doctorate at the Kune Graduate Center. Nicholas was not your typical pianist. He was also a composer and an academic, and he was gradually building himself up into the complete artist. Nicholas was happy. And then one day, something marvelous would happen. Something that would change his life forever. The year was 2018. The city, Calgary, Alberta, Canada. By this time, Nicholas had spent 4 years preparing for himself for the big stage. That first step was at the Honens International Piano Competition, Canada's grand slam of international piano competitions. Through each and every round, Nicholas performed his heart out and showed the extent of his training, technique, and musicality. After surviving each round, Nicholas won first prize at Honens. This would launch his performing career to new heights, as he would perform around the world in the most renowned concert halls, and would record a vast array of piano repertoire with Hyperion, Steinway & Sons, Honens, and Edition Clavier Festival Ruhr. Not only is Nicholas known for his virtuosic performance, he is also known for his beautiful compositions and his groundbreaking academic research. From various commissioned works to music for films and even standalone original repertoire, Nicholas's compositions have been performed, recorded, and enjoyed many times around the world, including on Adagio. Nicholas's doctoral thesis developed mathematical models for aspects of musical perception, and he even won the Barry Brook Award for Dissertation of the Year. His doctoral thesis is now published by Springer as the book Ligeti's Macroharmonies in the Computational Music Science series. During the pandemic, only a couple years after winning Honens, Nicholas completed postgraduate studies at the Institute of Psychiatry, Psychology, and Neuroscience at King's College London in England. Most recently, Nicholas has combined his neuroscience expertise with his musical knowledge in a new project called the Neurorecital, where he live streams an EEG of his own brain in real time while performing a vast array of classical music repertoire for a live in-person concert audience. As of the date of this recording, Nicholas has just debuted the Neurorecital at the world-renowned Verbier Festival. As Canada's Royal Conservatory of Music says in their motto, "The finest instrument is the mind," and Nicholas's work literally shows, highlights, and proves this motto. Nicholas has composed, written, published, and performed musical stories to the world. But now it is time to tell his story, his adventures, his legend. This is the legend of Nicolas Namoradze. Nico, thank you so much for coming on to the show.
Thank you for having me and for such a lovely introduction.
So let's start off from the very, very beginning. What inspired you to pursue piano?
Well, I had always been obsessed with music as a child. At any given moment, I was listening obsessively to different kinds of music, perhaps with the exception of a couple years when I was just obsessively building Lego. So I think that the experience of building a lot of Lego actually gave me a jump start in terms of piano technique and thinking architecturally, so to speak. So I began studying the piano when I was 7 years old, but music had always been a part of my life.
That's fascinating. And you're mentioning how you're just building Lego. I would assume that even just the creative part of that would have influenced some parts of of your early, I guess, influences towards the pianistic techniques. And on top of that, what other influences that you have at the time that would have influenced your trajectory into piano?
Well, yes, I think that the Lego definitely influenced not only my piano playing, but my thinking as a composer and creator and putting things together, so to speak. I began studying the piano in Budapest, in Hungary. That's where I grew up. And I think that the kind of Hungarian piano tradition definitely had an effect. I was listening to a lot of, Annie Fischer and Cifra, but of course, the living Hungarian pianists such as András Schiff and Zoltán Kocsis, people who then I was fortunate enough to call my teachers and mentors later on. But I was just really immersed in the world of the piano. I would listen to historical recordings a lot. It was very much part of the kind of musical upbringing and immersion that I had, and really inheriting this tradition that was present there, not only as a pianist, but in terms of how to think about music. Hungary has a very strong tradition in solfeggio and ear training and music theory. And it really forced me to think about music with a kind of bird's eye view, not to get too stuck into the details of piano playing, though that's, of course, so important. But from the very beginning, I had a really broad and kind of wide range of inputs and a really broad view of what it means to be a musician.
And that's something that I was also curious about, also in terms of not just your influences with your piano playing, but even being in the vicinity of those areas, even kind of in the broader sense of Budapest as well as with Tbilisi in Georgia. What was the music culture like in those areas? Because I would assume it would be pretty rich, especially with all the history that has been going through there. As you mentioned, some of the well-known pianists from even the 20th century, but even going for centuries, there has been quite a well-documented history in these areas. So what was it like?
Well, yes. I mean, I would consider both Georgia, the place where I was born, but moved away from quite early on. My family moved to Hungary when I was very young, and Budapest. So Hungary, these cities, these countries, both really punch above their weight in the classical music world. We're talking about very small countries. I mean, Hungary is a country of about 10 million these days. Georgia just under 4 million, and these countries have both produced so many wonderful musicians, composers, pianists, instrumentalists, conductors. I mean, today the classical music scene is awash with wonderful Georgian musicians. I mean, really a very high number per capita. I mean, if you think of the population and the number of great Georgian musicians that you can think of. And the same applies to Hungary. I mean, you had generation after generation of these incredible artists and some of the greatest composers of their generations and centuries. I mean, starting from Liszt, of course, but if you think of the 20th century, people like Dohnányi or later on Kurtág and Ligeti. I mean, Ligeti is, of course, a composer particularly dear to my heart. I did my doctoral research on Ligeti. So these were very rich musical inheritances. And there was this sense in both of these quite small countries that classical music was something to be really protected and honored and valued. And that was a kind of approach that I found very meaningful.
Yeah. And even just hearing that experience really, it shows a lot of that foundational element and the cultural element that I think is taken for granted even sometimes here in the Western world, where it's like, I mean, these things. I mean, here in the West, in Canada and the U.S., there's still among the average population. Oh, there are certain things that are happening culturally. Okay, yeah, well, that's going to happen because it always has been that way. But there isn't really much of a at least among the general population, much of a push to necessarily protect it as much as what I've seen, especially in classical music, where many people here are not familiar here with that type of music. It's you don't really see that kind of push, that kind of cultural initiative to move in that kind of direction, which is very different from what I've heard from even a lot of Eastern European countries like Georgia and in Hungary. As you mentioned, punching way above their weight and putting that initiative in protecting that part of their culture.
Absolutely. It's both a societal question and a cultural question, as well as, in some sense, a political question. To what extent do we have public funding for the arts? And in that sense, I think Canada is doing much better than the States. So it really depends, I guess, on where one is as well. I think in big cities, in the States, you have really vibrant musical scenes, vibrant classical music scenes. The same applies to Canada, but these are very big countries, and you have these great centers that are quite spread apart. So it's a very different kind of system. But I'm very heartened to see that there are so many wonderful centers for the piano, especially in North America. I find that there are these wonderful piano hubs, Calgary being one of them, and they fight the good fight, so to say. So yeah. It's great to be a part of this world. Yes,
absolutely. And yeah, like you said, it's they fight the good fight here in Canada. And going back to your experiences, I mean, even early on in your own performative experiences, already at 12 years old, you had your orchestral debut. Take us back to that debut. What was it like?
Right. So yes, I think my proper solo debut was a couple years earlier. I think I was about 10 years old. That was in Tbilisi in Georgia, shortly followed by the orchestral debut. And I mean, I felt like a fish in water. I remember actually my first experience playing with an orchestra was jumping in for a pianist who was in her 90s. Actually, a very great Hungarian pianist with a special reputation, Livia Rave. She is something of a kind of connoisseur's pianist. She made many recordings and has a particular following. But that was the first time I got to play with an orchestra. And I remember this immediate connection to the process and the joy of making music with a group of people. And yeah, actually, I just bumped into that conductor not too long ago after a hiatus of many years, and he still remembers that first encounter. So it was quite charming.
It certainly is. Wow, and a stepping in at the last minute and having that debut, that is truly amazing, and would be signs of things to come for you in your career, as you would then go across Budapest, Vienna, and Florence in these particular three cities. How have each of these respective local music scenes and cultures influenced your musical style as you grew older into your adulthood? And how have they shaped your overall understanding of music in a foundational sense?
Well, interestingly, I think that my presence in the other two cities, apart from Budapest, that you mentioned, so Florence and Vienna, exerted more of an influence just in terms of the kind of cultural scene that was there, and especially the galleries and the art that was there. The musical instruction actually came both from teachers that had kind of represented for many years the kind of Soviet/Russian school. So in Vienna, this was with Oleg Meisenberg, and in Florence with Elisa Virsaladze. So they did not in any meaningful way represent the local music scene, but rather this great tradition that I also felt fortunate to inherit, because it was a very different approach from what I had kind of absorbed in Hungary, which is much more influenced by the kind of Austrian and Germanic schools. So it's a very different approach, and the Hungarian school is a thing in itself, of course. Kind of the descendants of Liszt in Hungary very much had their own approach, and then were of course deeply affected and influenced by people like Bartok and Dochnányi. So it was very different. So I think my musical life was very peripatetic. I was jumping around and absorbing many things from different places. It was a kind of very syncretic musical education that I very much appreciated, because I was always picking and choosing what I thought was interesting from these different approaches and creating a kind of amalgamation, so to say, that felt right for me. I was something of a musical nomad. So being in Vienna and Florence was really a kind of privilege, simply to get to visit the museums and galleries and just be in the city and absorb the cultural scene. It's something that I think ideally everyone should get to go through if you want to play the music of these traditions. Somehow, I think that as teachers, we are also cultural ambassadors, and so much about, let's say, playing the music of Mozart, Beethoven, Haydn, Schubert, the kind of Viennese school, is partly simply understanding the particular approach of notation and how these composers spoke a particular language. Of course, we like to think of music as universal, but it is the case that these certain traditions and schools speak a particular language, and we have to try to approach it and understand it and kind of absorb it through the context and through the cultural milieu to really understand where this language comes from.
Yeah, and you mentioned this particular language and also studying, for example, the Viennese school with Mozart, Haydn, and Beethoven. I had John Kimura Parker, on an earlier episode of my podcast of this series, and we were having this conversation about the complete artist, which I'll also be having with you a little bit later on in this episode. And he brought up how it's important to bring up different contexts from different areas. So, for example, you can't just necessarily look at just the music itself, but also look at other musical influences, but even also other artistic, non-musical influences as well. Even some of the political influences of the time as well, right? One good example is Chopin and Poland, right? Poland did not exist during the time. As a country, Poland didn't exist during that time when Chopin was alive. And despite that, there's still a very strong patriotic sense, a strong cultural sense within the Polish people. That there was no country, but there was a people. And so you heard that through Chopin, especially through his polonaises and through his mazurkas and other pieces that introduced a lot of the traditional Polish rhythms and melodies and themes. So that sort of influence, non-musical and musical, I think really informs a lot of, even modern day, even when it comes to composition or performance, it really informs that, and it gives more picture and depth into a specific art piece, especially a musical art piece.
Absolutely. I mean, another example is something like Bartok's music, which is so intimately connected to both the Hungarian language and Hungarian folk music. I mean, the way these rhythms are organized and the way you read the notated rhythms on the page and knowing what kind of rubato is stylistically appropriate or not appropriate has to be informed by an understanding of the language and the folk music. So whenever I teach Bartok, if a student brings a Bartok piece, the first thing I have them do is just to listen to a lot of Hungarian folk music, especially vocal music, and hearing the inflections and the rhythms and the way in which in Hungarian you always accent the first syllable of a word, which is something that then permeates into the rhythms of the music. And once one gets that idea, of course, one doesn't have to speak Hungarian or be Hungarian or, need to have lived in Hungary or anything like that. But one has to do the research and one has to really understand from what this material is coming. The same with Schubert. I mean, there's so much in Schubert that is derived from, Ländler and Austrian folk music and mountain music and city music. And of course, one doesn't need to be an expert in these things, and one doesn't have to be able to play this music, as in the folk music, at the piano or analyze it or become a scholar of it. Not at all. But one has to understand just basically the kind of the source material for this, because then when Schubert writes a certain kind of rhythm, when he notates a rhythm with our very limited capacities to notate rhythms and inflections on the printed page, this is just referring to something else that he had in mind. And one thing that's very helpful with a composer like Bartok is that we have his recordings. And then you can look at the score, and then you listen to the recording, and you realize the kinds of freedoms he takes and the extent to which the notation is just a symbol. It's a signal for a certain kind of rhythm, but you can't read it literally. So there's a lot that one has to do, especially for this kind of music. And as I said, I think a big part of being a pedagogue is to impart that kind of cultural context of this music in the working process with the student.
Yeah, and ultimately every composer and performer, they bring a part of their own cultural background into the music. Every composer and performer that has existed and will ever exist will bring that forward into this, right? So, I mean, even just me, just thinking off the top of my head, I mean, I'm Canadian. I was born and raised in Canada, but I'm of ethnic Chinese descent. So I'm not an expert in Chinese music. I don't want to call myself that, but being familiar with that cultural side, even hearing the pentatonism in even some of the more modern Chinese classical composers, you hear that sort of, you were mentioning about language, being a Cantonese speaker primarily and speaking a bit of Mandarin as well. I can even hear that actually in some of the written melodies as well, because it's very tonal. Like our languages are very tonal, especially Cantonese. Well, Cantonese, Mandarin has 4 tones. Cantonese, I think, has like 6 to 9 tones. It's still, I mean, some people consider certain things tones, some not, but around that level of tone. So I would infer that sort of linguistic tonalism translates into much of the music, not just folk, but also even modern, and with the classical parts of that as well, with some of the more recent classical pieces written by both Southern and Northern Chinese composers overall. So even just thinking about that, like it's interesting you brought up the linguistic part, because yeah, that even outside of the European classical music tradition, I think even in other musical traditions, there's even that influence.
Oh, absolutely. And when I've played, especially new music by composers who are deriving many musical aspects and compositional elements or materials in the pieces from a certain kind of folk tradition, I know I need to do my research. And it has to be part of the preparation process, because I know that it's not something I'm familiar enough with. And listening to the language and the folk music will give me a sense of the sonority, of the inflections, of the rubato, all this kind of thing. Even if one's playing a Debussy piece that was influenced, let's say, by Indonesian gamelan, you have to go and listen to the gamelan, because you start to get an idea of what Debussy had in his ear when he was writing this music, for example. So I think that, this is something really necessary across the board. And it's interesting, well, you mentioned Cantonese, because that's actually a language I particularly love listening to, partly because I find the tones so musical and fascinating, and also because, I mean, I'm a little biased. My favorite film director is Wong Kar-wai. Actually, I'm a big fanatic of his work. I've watched everything. Almost everything. I haven't watched Blossoms, the recent series he came out with, but until his big break, I've watched everything many times. And so whenever I hear Cantonese, it always takes me back to this body of work and just the extraordinary pictures of the human experience that he paints with them. So yeah, it's something particularly dear to my heart.
Yeah, and you mentioned I'm so happy. First of all, I'm so happy to hear that you're a big fan of that, and second of all, like even just like being just kind of like parking just a little bit, even in terms of filmmaking, and even in terms of the performative aspects of acting, even like there's even parallels between acting and musicianship as well. Leung Chiu-wai, or basically he's a very, very famous actor who was actually in Shang-Chi. He played the villain. That particular actor. He's known for having such a wide range of emotional expressiveness just through his eyes, right? And it's really all in the eyes of how he's able to express himself from an acting part. But like that sort of like impliedness and that ability to express himself through that way, I think also translates well into music, because I mean, it's oversimplifying to say that it's all in the fingers, but it's also like how you approach the piano, even from a technical perspective, that also affects the way how the performance is done. Like for Janina, for example, when I had her on the show, she was describing how she had the difference between the Courteau technique and the Gorodnitsky technique, where the Courteau technique is more, it's a bit more flowery, a bit more light, a bit lighter, and she typically uses it for more like Haydn, Mozart, or the classical era composers. Whereas for Gorodnitsky, it's a lot stronger, it's a lot more deep. So she tends to use that for like more later romantic or 20th century types of pieces, or when she needs like a bit more power, more access to a bit more power in terms of her expression. There's even that difference there too as well. So that expressiveness in language, in also physical and emotional expression, whether it's through the eyes or the fingers or the arms even, I think is so, it informs much of how certain things are done in really the art forms that you're doing, especially in music overall in that sense as well.
Yeah, absolutely. I in fact use the metaphor of acting and drama very frequently when I teach, and also just when I think about interpretation, because one really is in many ways an actor. One is portraying through the notes on the page, which is our version of the words on the page, a certain kind of psychological process, a drama, a certain story, a narrative. And that narrative has to be coherent for an audience to be convinced by an actor's monologue of, I don't know, Hamlet or whatever it is that you want to take. The way in which the moods follow each other have to be believable, and they have to make sense. I mean, if you're doing a Beckett play and the point is to be surreal, that's a different story. But the idea is somehow that there is a narrative that we follow, or an effect that we follow, and somehow we, especially as piano soloists, are entirely in control of that narrative and how we portray it. And we have to be very conscious of how that comes across. And, you know, like an actor, we have many tools at our disposal physically. And these principles and concepts can be very useful in terms of how we organize our physical motions. But it's also just very useful to think very concretely about what the piano can do. And one thing that I feel is kind of one of the key messages that I try to share when I speak about piano playing is really understanding what the mechanism can and cannot do, and really understanding what actually happens in the piano, which I find we generally tend to be quite ignorant of, because then we realize there's so much that is taught in piano playing or that we do that just doesn't have any effect whatsoever on the sound, and we're wasting a lot of energy. So, you know, I am bringing in now the very scientific approach, but one has to be scientific. One has to understand what does affect the sound production and what doesn't affect the sound production, so that one can be economical and really kind of direct one's energies and attention to the parameters that do affect sound, that do affect tone. Tone is still a relatively mysterious concept. You know, what does influence tone quality of a single note? You know, the acceleration or slowing down into the note. And there has been some research on this. And one kind of has to become acquainted with how this works, so that in the practice room, you know, in this process of repeating things for hours and hours and hours, one isn't doing the wrong thing.
And I think that's also one thing that, even in Canada, from my own experience in learning piano over the time. Now, my first piano teacher was my mom, and my second piano teacher was a person by the name of Wang Yang, who did his degree at the New England Conservatory and had an artist diploma during his time there, and did a number of competitions, won a number of competitions as well. But one thing that I realized from both of their experiences, don't get me wrong, they were a great experience, and I'm always forever grateful for them, but they missed that scientific aspect of that, right? There sometimes, when it comes to the reason why we do a certain thing, don't get me wrong, again, it's very important that we know the musical reason behind it, but the scientific reason behind it, as you said, at least in my experience, was missing. And it's by no fault of theirs at all. I want to be clear on that point. It's just that they didn't have that kind of background. And I would even say many musicians don't necessarily have that sort of background necessarily into the deep scientific parts of why a tone is done a certain way. So especially with pianos, with every piano being different in some way, but also considering modern pianos and period pianos, there's the difference in the construction, and then there's the difference in the materials being used, and there's the difference as a result of how a pianist would have to approach these different pianos. I think that also requires, I should be careful in saying requiring, that might be a bit of a stronger word, but it does need an understanding, as you said, into the science behind the tone, but also even the science behind the engineering of the piano too.
Absolutely. And the thing is that, what your experience was is actually by far the most common experience. And, lots of wonderful teachers, the vast majority, are simply passing on traditions that have been inherited, and this is just simply the way it's been. And just now I'm seeing more research into the actual nitty-gritty of what's going on. And there's also a very interesting study going on at MIT looking at the physiology of piano playing, how the bones move, how the tendons and ligaments move. And this is very good. So the idea of really trying to break this down and approach it in a scientific way is really a quite new phenomenon. We've inherited this tradition, most of which works well. I mean, this happened through trial and error. People saw, if I move my elbow this way, it seems to produce this kind of sound. So let's do that. And so all this, of course, works more or less, and not all of it. And the trouble is some of these approaches have led people to injury, or just misusing the hand, or actually wasting energy on stuff that doesn't really make a difference, and not paying attention to the thing that does make the difference. Of course, it's not practical to try to measure the speed of every note, the acceleration or slowing down into the note, the kind of velocity you're at when you activate the escapement. Of course, this stuff, you can't think like that when you're approaching the instrument, but one has to just be aware of what the parameters are that do affect the sound, because then you start from what's the final product I want in terms of how the key is moving down. And then I reverse engineer, okay, what does my shoulder need to do? What does my elbow need to do? What are the larger physical movements that can help affect that? But if we start the other way and think, if you do this with your shoulder, that means you'll have a nice rich sound. Well, no, you might probably, but you might also just be doing the completely wrong thing and not understand why it's not working. So you need to have a balance of both just the concrete result that you're getting, and then how are you going to engineer that. But what I see a lot in piano teaching is that we start from thinking that, if you hold your shoulder this way, this is going to just be the solution to creating a rich sound. Well, no, all our shoulders are different. We might be misusing the shoulders. And even if we hold it this way, then we still don't get the right sound. And most pianists, many of us have issues listening to ourselves as well, because the fact of the matter about the piano is that we get such a strong kinesthetic response from the keyboard that we don't need to listen to ourselves to know if we're playing the right note or not. String players have different issues and questions about listening, but the mere response of your finger on the fingerboard of a violin, for example, isn't enough for you to know if you're playing in tune or not. You have to be listening to check that you're playing in tune. At the piano, I could play at the dummy keyboard and know if I'm playing the right notes or not. So for pianists, it's very easy for us to turn the listening off and just be purely in the process of, pushing buttons or just creating those sounds without really monitoring what's going on. So we do have a whole set of things we have to become more aware of. And I think that today there is a push to start looking at these things more concretely, rather than simply inherit something that has been taught for 100 or so years without much questioning. And I think that, interestingly, I'm 32 right now, but I started teaching quite early. I basically really got into teaching 2 years ago. And as you mentioned, I teach at a couple places now, as well as master classes all the time when I'm traveling. And I think that one thing that made me interested in teaching is that I've always been teaching myself and always been questioning everything. So I think partly because of the fact that I got a lot of input from different schools and different people and had many different teachers, I never took anything as the word of God, and was always questioning and wondering and testing things out and taking things lightly, and somehow never actually took the process of being taught that seriously in a good way. So basically, it was always a question of, okay, there's this. Now, how do I work with this and integrate it and understand it and try to understand what makes this approach tick, rather than say, okay, the master said this, I do it. And if anything, what I try to teach is how to think for yourself as a student, and how to teach yourself, and how to be a problem solver, and really take yourself through the process and be your own teacher, rather than simply inherit wisdom, which we of course should do because it's a tradition. It's a kind of trust we have in people who know better than us and have a lot more experience than us. But there should always be a process of a dialogue between what input you get and then what you kind of then give back out.
Yeah, totally, absolutely. And I think a very good example of that, and it's not really a musical example, but I mean, Bruce Lee did that with martial arts in many ways,
right. Mm-hmm.
where originally he was studying Wing Chun, but he realized even after just going through his first match that he won the match, but he's like, I shouldn't have had that much difficulty with it. And when he realized that he had so many different limitations with just studying Wing Chun, which has so many impractical elements right. combined with the practical parts, he realized, oh, I need to actually go past that. I have to learn from other schools of martial arts, boxing, and kickboxing, taekwondo, and grappling, all these sorts of different martial arts disciplines. And then he created one of the first systems of Jeet, right? So and taking what works, leaving what doesn't work, and then using what works and developing on that and trying to improve based off of that. That's what made him very legendary, and not just in the martial artist sense, but also in a philosophical sense as well. And speaking about just the movements of the arms, the shoulders, the fingers, the hands, the wrists, I'm starting to wonder if there is a kinesiological explanation for that as well, because kinesiology is typically, I see a lot of athletes or student athletes here in Canada and in the US, whenever they're competing for a varsity team, many of them typically take kinesiology as their major for studying human movement and the physical movement. I'm starting to wonder, though, if some of that can be applied towards musical performance, because I've always thought of the performance of piano as not starting at the keys, like starting even as early from the brain and then going down to your shoulders and then your arms, your forearm, your wrists, and your hands and your fingers. So I'm wondering if there's a kinesiological explanation or school of thought or even studies. There may be a good number of them that may be out there, but I'm starting to wonder if that could also be used to help musicians and pianists in particular approach these particular expressions and being more proficient performers, really, of the music.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, these are all very important points. Circling back to the question of Bruce Lee, I think he's a wonderful example of someone who really integrated many aspects of different approaches into something that was more efficient. And as you said, I think one important part of that was also kind of the philosophy behind it and the kind of mental approach and the state of mind that was part of the physical approach. And I think that's very important for musicians. And of course, one interest of mine, for many years now has been mental practice and just the mental side of the whole thing. And when it comes to kind of the physiology and kinesiology, I mean, of course, this is very important. I remember many years ago reading this very interesting book called What Every Pianist Needs to Know About the Body by Thomas Mark. And it related to certain principles in something like Alexander technique, but it was really a kind of anatomy book. What are the principles that you need to know as a pianist? How do the bones work? How does energy transfer work? Something as simple as not locking your wrist, because if you think about, let's say, a bridge, the reason why a bridge can be stable and distribute energy to the shore is that it's slightly curved. And if it were totally straight, then the bridge would collapse under the pressure of the cars. The same applies to the hand, to be able to transmit the energy from the shoulder and the abdominal muscles and whatever like that as as soon as you lock your wrist, there's no way to actually transfer the energy from the upper muscles to the fingers, for example. So it's a simple principle, but it's just based in physics, just basic physical principles. And as soon as you lock your wrist, actually, then you have to rely on movement from the knuckles to create power, which is not a very good thing, because then you're relying exclusively on the extensor and flexor muscles in the forearm, and you're also causing a lot of tension in your tendons, which can cause inflammation. So, basic physiological principles that are really essential. And then you see like some old Baroque treatises where people are playing harpsichord like this, and this is taught as the right way to do it. And then you realize they had no clue what they were doing. They really didn't. So you have to be very careful. And also, if something worked for one person, that is not a good sample size, or even two people. I mean, of course, I don't know if we have the funding to start a big research project on every aspect of piano physiology, but I mentioned the study at MIT, which is kind of doing that thing. And I think many of the listeners here might have come across videos on Instagram or YouTube of people hooked up to all kinds of nodes and or kind of various scanners just to see how the bones and soft tissue is moving, for example, when playing the piano, loudly, softly, quickly, slowly, and what's going on in the body and what kind of sound you produce. So we're starting to get into the nitty-gritty here and try to understand how these schools of piano work, what does work, what doesn't work. And I think this is really important, because I think that in many ways, the sports are so much further ahead of us. There's a lot more funding in sport. There's a lot more research. It's a lot more rigorous. And in some ways, we have to follow their lead. When I first became interested in the question of mental practice, I had to read sports psychology books. I mean, there really wasn't very much for students of music, for performers. And now there's much more, because we're taking, this example and following the sports world in many ways. I mean, so many principles apply to playing the piano, for example, that you can find in the ways athletes are trained and prepared. I mean, I remember reading this article many years ago. It was one of the first pieces of inspiration that put me on the path of thinking about what it means to be a performer in a really broad sense. It was an article about Michael Phelps, the world famous swimmer, the Olympic record breaker, so to speak, many records, in fact. And it was this extraordinary article about how Michael Phelps would often spend as much time, if not more time, doing mental practice than actual swimming. And, I thought this was just crazy, because, I mean, swimming is great. And with all due respect to swimmers and sprinters, I mean, playing a Bach partita is a good deal more cognitively demanding. It's a good deal more cerebral than going back and forth in a straight line. Yet these sprinters and swimmers were doing more mental practice and using somehow the kind of powers of the brain and neuroplasticity and visualization techniques and imagination and getting into the zone and flow mentally than we were doing. So it felt clear that there was a kind of missing piece in how musicians are trained. So I think there's a lot more we can derive our expertise from, whether it's through the study of the body and anatomy and physiology and how the piano works and how the brain works and all these kinds of sources can really, I think, change and improve and help musicians play their best.
Yeah, and I'm so glad you mentioned the issue of sports psychology. Speaking from my own experience as a sports announcer for basketball, volleyball, and various different sports, I've even announced national swimming events, so I've personally had to follow and describe in real time on live broadcast, national broadcast and commentary for this. Actually, as of the date of this recording, I announced 4 months ago, I was on CBC Sports announcing one of their university sports events. And I see time and time again, athletes from every single one of these sports disciplines, when they go into these events, especially swimming, you really hear it in swimming, they hype themselves up so much. And I'm just speaking from an anecdotal experience. They hype themselves so much. And especially, it may be an individual endeavor, unless you're swimming a relay. But you have your entire swimming club behind you, right? You have your university in this case, but in national events or trials, for example, a good example is the Canadian swimming trials or the American swimming trials or any kind of national trials that you have to qualify to win in order to qualify for either the Olympics or the World Championships. You see that morale, you see that hyping up, you see them loudly cheering not just themselves on, but their teammates on who are swimming in the pool, going back and forth, however many lengths of the pool that they're swimming in whatever discipline that they are. You see it and you feel it. And I even feel it as much as in my chest even. And I could be standing a good 100 meters away, but I would feel it like deep in my chest. And it's like, whoa, this really hits a certain way. Same thing with basketball. Even just before they go in with tip off in the first quarter, you see that sort of mindset. Now, of course, it's very different from music in the sense that you're not trying to hype yourself up to like throw a ball or something like that in music, but it's still that, as you mentioned, that ability to kind of just mentally prepare yourself for that performance, even in music. It's a different kind of way, but it's still like a similar thing. But there's so much we can learn from the athletes in that sense, because if anything, music is not just more cerebral, but it could also be very physical as well, especially when you're playing one of the more technically challenging pieces. And I think that, like, as you said, we do it, but I don't know if we necessarily do it as much as the athletes do. I think maybe compared to some athletes, maybe, but for I know for a fact compared to like basketball or volleyball, probably not as much, or especially American football, for example, is a very big one in America. I'm rambling a little bit on this point, but I think there's so much that can be said about this one particular point that we were just talking about.
I mean, absolutely. I mean, first of all, it checks out that you've worked as a sportscaster, because I was wondering when you were giving the introduction, I felt like I was walking into a basketball match or something like that. So this is very impressive. And yes, I think we should hype ourselves up. I think we should. And, you know, there are routines for this and things we can do to put us in the right state of mind. I mean, maybe we don't want to be hyped up in the sense that, you know, play as quickly or loudly as possible, because, of course, in this case, the character of the music might not be kind of amenable to that kind of energy. But I mean, I do like a set of qigong exercises actually before every performance, because I feel like it gets my body moving and my energy moving in a way that feels right, that I'm actually directing mentally where my kind of physical attention is going and where my eye, like my mind's eye is going. It's a really great combination of a kind of mental concentration that is translating into physical motion. So yeah, I mean, we should have our routines and have our processes, and it really helps. It really helps, especially because, you know, as a musician, you're traveling a lot. You're moving between trains and planes and hotels, and sometimes you didn't get enough sleep, or you couldn't eat well, or the hotel was uncomfortable, or you just arrived because of a delayed flight just 1 hour before the performance. But the audience doesn't care. They bought their tickets. They want their money's worth. I mean, to put it very crudely, of course. And you have to go out on stage and no excuses, and you perform. And you have to have ways to be able to maintain that stability despite the storms and vicissitudes of life. You go out on stage and somehow have to have a way to get yourself into the place where you can still say what you want to say and move your listeners. And that takes training. And the more you train, the less you are dependent or at the mercy of having a good day, or, you know, or happening to have a bad day. You have more agency over the situation.
Yeah. And agency is something that, especially as pianists, as you mentioned, for performing pianists, they're constantly on the move, constantly traveling. And it could be very isolating too. And even, I would even say, even for violinists too, solo violinists, it could be very isolating for them. But at least they're performing chamber music or orchestral music, that sort of thing. But for pianists, many times I mean, many pianists do perform chamber music and orchestral music, but many of them also perform solo, mostly solo concerts entirely. So even having that experience of being on your own most of the time can be very isolating, and with isolation comes potentially the risk of mental issues, mental illness issues, and all that sorts of things as well. So like, being able to know how to prepare yourself mentally, I think is so. I mean, you will also know in your own research as well, is very, very important. And I think there are so many important lessons to learn from each of these different sources of materials, and that's why it's always important to constantly learn. Right? It's you never stop learning, especially when you're in an artistic experience. You never stop learning, and sometimes you would even get some of the most interesting learning experiences from places that you would never have even thought of. But then it's like, whoa, it clicks something in your head. Oh, that's how I can do it. I can do it this way.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, it's a lifelong process, and I think that's the joy of something like the arts and just having a life in this, in that you're never finished. It's always a process. And perhaps you've been working on a piece of music for many months and years, and you record it, and then the next day you think of something new and something different. And that recording is really just a snapshot in time. So it's a living, breathing thing. And it just feels like I think we all should feel privileged to get to live this art and be in constant communication with some of the most extraordinary things that humans have created. It's a really special process.
It truly is a very special process. And speaking about special, as we hone in on Honens, what inspires you to hone in on Honens? AKA, what inspires you to compete in Honens?
Well, yes, as you mentioned in your introduction, I took a couple years off from competing or performing actively to kind of, quote unquote, find myself in terms of what repertoire I wanted to play, how I wanted to play it, what I was most drawn to, develop my portfolio as a composer, write more music, work on my doctoral dissertation, start teaching. I mean, actually, during my doctoral dissertation, I was teaching music history and music theory and composition and chamber music, and really kind of trying to become as familiar as possible with as many musical disciplines as possible. And I kind of marinated in this very open, experimental, free space for a while before I thought, okay, I think I'm ready to kind of go back and give the limelight a shot. And I was very lucky. Honens was the first competition I did. It was kind of one and done kind of situation. I was glad to have been fortunate to do well there and win it and not need to do any further competitions. And, I think that the whole idea of the complete artist and the competition's ethos really spoke to me. This idea that the kind of winner that Honens wanted to, in their approach, somehow embody, was that of an artist that again, had their vision very set to a kind of broad zoom. And really taking in inspiration from many sources, which was reflected in how the competition was structured. So it wasn't just, airy-fairy language, but it was very concrete in terms of the fact that you had enormous freedom in the repertoire that you would pick. For the solo programs, we had basically complete freedom. So we were not only showing how we played, but what we wanted to program and how we were presenting our portfolios as artists. There was also a very strong chamber music element in the competition in various formats. We performed with a singer, we performed with a violinist, we performed with a wind quintet, so many different situations. And of course, then the concerti, and of course, having basically free choice as to what concerto to play. And for example, for my big romantic concerto, I chose Brahms 2, which generally is not considered a wise choice for competitions because it's something that needs a lot of rehearsal time. It's very long and very complex, and there are lots of duets and various small chamber units that appear during the work. So it's something you ideally want to have enough rehearsal time for, and in a competition you get one rehearsal, a quick rehearsal, which is enough for a run through if you're playing a 15-minute piece, and then a quick dress rehearsal. So I somehow felt like it was the nature of the competition that allowed me to take risks. I mean, one other crazy risk I took was to play my own music. I played my own etudes in the semifinal solo round, which again is always considered a no-no in competitions. It's a way to get the jury annoyed at you. But it just felt like the kind of competition where I could just be myself and not be apologetic about it and not try to adjust what it is I was presenting to the quote unquote correct competition strategy, but just to say, okay, this is who I am as an artist, and I hope you enjoy it. And yeah, so I think that is what made this feel like the kind of competition I wanted to do. And I mean, turns out I was right. So yeah, it felt like a good fit.
Yeah, and it's certainly, even just like we were, this entire conversation so far up to this point, I mean, even from the moment that you were performing, even as a kid, and then the different things that you were learning, and even just going back to building Legos as a kid, I think that already was the foundational element that showed that you were embodying the complete artist already at this point. Because, and even just remembering my conversation with Jackie, his approach, he mentioned in his approach with how Honens was structured, exactly as you said, you could perform whatever program that you wanted to perform. For him, the reasoning behind it was that he wanted to ensure that Honens was a competition that Glenn Gould could have won. Right? Glenn Gould challenged so many different ways in how certain pieces are performed, but essentially for someone like Glenn Gould to have won. Now, I use another example, Ivo Pogorelic. I mean, his experience at the 1980 Chopin competition, and he long story short, genius but controversial for the time because of the various different reasons and details I won't get into. They weren't bad controversies. It's more of just like stylistic choices and musical choices, that kind of thing, right? But essentially, even for someone like him, if he were to try to time travel to today's time and compete in Honens, maybe he would have also had a chance to win the competition in that sort of vein. So I think in as we were saying, just all these different knowledge bases being put together and then being placed into a competition like this is something that I think is, and not just me, but many different news outlets, such as the New Yorker, for example, has said that Honens has something very different and unique in that approach, and which is why Canada, in many ways, is experiencing almost like a renaissance even of classical music, because it's not just classical music, it's like the full educational aspect behind that. And that's why I think you had such a good experience there and you had such a good fit there, because you embodied that in so many different levels.
Right, absolutely. And this approach, this idea that, creating a competition that Glenn Gould could have won, really affected many aspects of how the competition is run, including actually the scoring and voting system, ensuring that you have candidates that are selected through majorities rather than consensus. Because if it's about consensus, you end up with candidates that everyone is okay with, but these aren't the candidates that some people love and some people really hate. But when it comes to simply the majority system, then there is the possibility of having controversial but interesting candidates that kind of press ahead. And I saw this firsthand in the voting process, because I just served on the quarterfinals jury, the first jury for Honens. And it was interesting to really get to familiarize myself with the voting system. I've now served on a couple juries, which has been a very interesting process. And you see that every competition approaches this differently. And ideally, in an ideal world, whatever mathematical system a competition has doesn't affect the result. Ideally, somehow the candidates that deserve to win. But actually, the fact of the matter is the way in which the votes are tallied, and whether or not the extreme votes are somehow canceled out or compensated for, or the way in which the averages are created, or what systems are in place to kind of combine different aspects of the voting. There's a lot one can talk about here. We shouldn't turn this into a mathematics conversation, but these things do influence how the results come out. And I think that by now we've had several decades of experience in competitions and many controversies, of course. And by now we're really looking, I think, at the question of how competitions work with a lot more rigor. We've been talking about becoming more scientific with piano playing, but the same applies to this kind of thing, really trying to make sure the systems are as fair as possible and make sure that the results are as representative of how the jury responds to the artists and making sure that there are no impediments to that. So it's an interesting process and an interesting conversation to be a part of. I think that, of course, the landscape is changing very much, and perhaps competitions don't necessarily have the kind of centrality to making a career as they used to a couple of decades ago, because we have, the internet. It's much easier to get your material out there than it was several decades ago, where you had certain places to go, competitions to go to be heard. Funnily enough, I mean, my career is very varied in terms of what I do, but the way in which I created a career was quite traditional, actually just going to a competition, even though the competition itself was not your typical traditional competition. And it's interesting to see the extent to which other competitions, much older competitions, have actually adopted principles from Honens. I mean, the voting system is used widely now by other competitions, kind of the mathematical system that was developed first for Honens, as well as the freedom in choosing the repertoire and the whole structure of how the competition works. It's interesting to see how influential Honens has become in the world of not only piano competitions, but musical competitions in general.
Totally. And especially with Honens being a very young competition too, only 33 years old. Right. So, I mean, you're pretty much, it started the year you were born, right? So
yes, exactly.
So it's exactly as old as you are. So it's still very, very, very young. So the fact that it's already had such an effect on the competitions beside it and around it. I mean, you were mentioning this. I was thinking about even how the International Chopin Competition, even how they had they released a whole PDF file of every single round of every single pianist that they've judged, and I'm starting to wonder that I could probably see some of the influences that Honens may have had even on that sort of system with the voting, especially with the final round, where it's just like I think it was a yes, no, or I'm not too sure. I could be wrong on this, but like even just seeing some of the voting influences there was truly fascinating, even as you mentioned that with Honens. And this goes back to even what you were saying about having a dialogue between in music. I mean, music eventually, or evidently, I should say, does not operate in a vacuum. I mean, knowledge in general cannot operate in a vacuum. And music, to be honest, is not self-indulgent. Like, you're playing music for someone, right? Of course, you're playing also, a part of it's also for yourself, but it's not just for yourself. Especially when you're a performer, you're performing for an audience, whether it's an audience of one other person or an audience of 1,000 other people, or in the case of the online space, an audience of over 1 million people or 10 million people. You're playing for someone. Right. So that dialogue, I think Honens, in many ways, even when I was reading through the principles and the philosophy behind it, I'm thinking, yeah, this very much hits that sort of dialogue in terms of everything, the whole encompassing part of musical pianistic performance.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, you're absolutely right in saying that this doesn't exist in a vacuum. And we as performers, we are a medium. We are not, the final stop. We are translating what a composer wrote into an experience for the listener. I mean, the listener could be ourselves if we're playing for ourselves, but we are the listener in some sense. And then ideally you have many people listening to you. And this music doesn't happen, again, in a vacuum without context. It is part of the world we are in. Styles change and approaches change, and it's interesting to see how piano playing has evolved, even since the dawn of the kind of recording as part of our musical culture. I mean, if you look at piano playing through the decades, it has changed so much. And these days, there's actually kind of a resurgence in interest in recordings of the silver and golden age, and actually old styles of piano playing. In some sense, we are returning to some approaches that defined recordings from about 100 years ago, that perhaps a couple decades ago would get you into a lot of trouble, which I think is a very good thing. So styles change, approaches change, and we are part of the world we live in, as performers, as composers, as musicians that are constantly in conversation with music from the past or music of our contemporaries, with our audience, with technology platforms that influence the way in which we make music in different ways. And yes, the whole classical music world itself is a living, breathing thing that also has to adapt in intelligent ways to the changing context. And of course, the pandemic brought many changes from which we've partly recovered, but some things can never stay completely the same, after such a seismic event such as this. So it's interesting to see how these things change and where we're going in the future.
Yeah, and even with musical training as a whole, even for people who don't go down a musical professional route, if they go down a different profession altogether, you still see that sort of influence in that respect as well. One good example that I can think of, that I actually wrote a paper on this, one of my final papers in law school on this, was Justice Rosalie Abella here in Canada. So for those in the audience who are not Canadian, Justice Rosalie Abella is a former Supreme Court justice here in Canada. She retired in 2021 because she turned 75. Constitutional law here in Canada says that if you turn 75, you cannot be a judge. You got to retire on your 75th birthday. And she just so happened to be born on July 1st, which is Canada Day, Confederation here in Canada. Actually, before law school, she graduated from the Royal Conservatory of Music. And she was a pianist. In fact, I was talking with one of her sons, who's also a lawyer, and he told me that actually Justice Abella was so good that she would have actually considered going down a performing route and would have actually considered the Chopin competition at one point. Now, I mean, the Chopin competition, I'm not sure that's confirmed, but she would have gone down a performing, maybe even a competitive route at some point. But her dad said it's best not to during that time especially, but so she changed career paths and became the legendary legal figure that she is today here in Canada. When I look at her Supreme Court decisions, and I use one of them in my paper, I think it was the Duez case. I keep forgetting the name of that, but I remember it was Duez. If you look at the way how she structures her written legal decision, it's basically rondo form. It's basically so musically ingrained into her writing that it's inescapable, especially when you have a musical background, when you understand what's going on here, right? Because a common question that I heard in law school from both professors and for law students at the time was, how is it that Supreme Court justices, especially Justice Abella in particular, why are they so clear in their own written responses? I mean, or decisions rather. I mean, at the end of the day, the Supreme Court cases are vast. They're hundreds of pages long even at times. And they basically, if they rule on something, every single court in the land, to oversimplify things, has to follow that because it's binding law, binding common law, I should say. So how is it possible to encapsulate all these different arguments, but then have a coherent decision? My argument was that it's because of her musical training. It's because of that understanding of rondo form, sonata, allegro form, ternary form, binary form, theme and variations, the whole gambit of harmonic structure and counter melodies and counterpoint overall. Even though she's not writing a piece of music, she is still writing music in legal form in the way how she's writing things. So I think even that example shows the effects of how musicality can be on a person.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's a very interesting topic you raise, and I kind of want to read your paper now because I think that's a very interesting argument to make. And one can also then ask, okay, So we understand these forms work and we can apply them to these different contexts. Why do these forms work? So what makes them tick, and why is a rondo form effective, or why did sonata form develop the way it did? And sometimes as musicians, we kind of inherit this from music theory that, okay, the sonata form is done in the following way. You have an exposition where you have two themes, and then in the middle you have this transition, and then in the development, yada, yada, yada. I mean, the reality of the matter is that this very kind of rigid sonata form was basically articulated by Czerny after composers had been writing sonata form, quote unquote sonata form pieces for many decades already. So then the question becomes actually, what did they think they were doing? They didn't have this kind of manual. So what was the principle behind it? And then you start to look at why the sonata form, let's say, defines the classical style. And it is basically the idea of conflict between different characters, textures, moods, so on and so forth, speeds, however it is you might want to articulate, essentially a kind of dramatic dissonance that is then worked out and resolved. That's basically it. But, in terms of how many key areas there are or how many subjects or all that, that was secondary, actually. And so we have to go back to understanding why that works. Or why does a rondo form work? Well, we understand from a kind of neuroscientific perspective that we like familiarity. Every time we hear something again, and I'm sure many of us have had this experience that there's like a pop song that we find really annoying and we kind of hate it. But just the familiarity of hearing it again in a mall or here or there or wherever it is, it kind of actually triggers a sense of familiarity and comfort, even with something that you might not be attracted to at the beginning, right? So in music, actually, there were some studies on this where people who were just listening to pieces of music, these were generated for the study, would rate the excerpts more highly if there was some element of thematic repetition. So if it was just completely open-ended and nothing would ever repeat, they rated the compositional quality as lower compared to something where there were fragments and elements that would come back and recur, and you'd recognize it and you'd be like, oh, I've heard this before. So then in the rondo form, this idea of a perfect balance between consistency and variety is something inherent in the form, and perhaps is what made this particular justice's arguments so compelling and coherent. This idea that you're introducing new ideas, but you keep circling back at regular intervals to the main argument that you're trying to present. I assume that was basically the key principle here. But, in musical performance, it is so essential to understand what are the kind of forces, the physical forces. I mean, I think we can often think of music in terms of like forces of gravity. How do various aspects of musical textures either attract or push each other away? And understanding why it works will then have a profound effect on one's interpretation, because you're reading beyond a kind of very rigid framework and understanding what are the dramatic principles. At the end of the day, this is a story. What are the dramatic principles that make something like this work? And I mean, there are some writers that took this very far. I mean, you think of someone like Murakami, who structured a novel like 1984 on the Goldberg variations and the well-tempered clavier in terms of like the number of chapters and the way in which they're organized. So there's a lot one can derive from the way in which these musical forms were developed over the centuries.
Yeah, and even just going back briefly to Justice Abella, essentially, well, for legal decision writing here, at least in Canada, the way how many judges write is in terms of why they're deciding on a certain thing. They address both sides of the argument, and then they go into depths on the cases that each side has cited, and then they also have their own team of people who also, like, their own clerks, their own legal team, who also do their own legal research and say, look at what previous cases have been said, right? And especially in a common law jurisdiction like Canada, with the exception of Quebec, which is a civil law jurisdiction, but Supreme Court operates basically almost in a common law sense. There's a lot of reference towards previous cases as well. So when it comes to precedent, huge deal in a common law jurisdiction. So for Justice Abella, it's sort of this formula of trying to make sure that everything is clear, but also disagreeing, even because justices at the Supreme Court disagree with each other, very often. And they're encouraged to do that if they genuinely believe that they should decide for or against a specific particular decision. Usually it's a constitutional decision, but even if it's like any other decision, typically is the same thing at that point. So I think that clarity in terms of music, I think is just where she drew from that to explain that that sort of having that point, saying why, going back, saying why, going back and forth. But there's always that thematic. We literally in legal litigation, we're literally taught this: the theory and the theme of a case. So it's actually very musical, even in that kind of terminology, even the way how we learn it. So that sort of clarity, I think, it informs a lot of how she was approaching that. But yeah, I mean, it was. I actually Justice Abella herself actually read the paper, and she was like, "Oh wow, I never actually thought about it that way."
Oh, very nice, interesting.
Yeah.
Well, maybe it just influenced her just in terms of just shaping her thinking from early on, even if it were not a conscious process.
Yeah. My law professors at the time, they were like, "Is it okay if I show it to Justice Abella?" I'm like, "Yeah, absolutely, show it to her." And she's like, "This is amazing. I never thought about that." I was like, "Oh snap, okay." Like, I was nervous though. I was like, am I just am I kind of like writing things out of thin air? Okay, thank goodness I wasn't. But
Interesting.
Yeah. So this entire conversation that we've had all comes down to musicality. What is musicality to you?
Well, I mean, that's a very big question. And I mean, maybe we should not start quoting, Schopenhauer and Nietzsche about what music is. But I mean, at the end of the day, music is a language. It's a means for expression. And musicality is the extent to which one is fluent in this language, and is able to express both the message or the content of the work that has been transmitted to us from the composer, as well as imbue it with our own way of expressing this into the kind of the musical experience that one gets. Of course, this is quite specific to actually playing the pieces of certain composers. I mean, music is a much greater thing than playing the music printed on a page. I mean, we're talking about improvisation, we're talking about folk music, we're talking about every kind of musical tradition that is simply a process of transmitting the human experience into sound, into musical sound. I mean, the question as to what are the limits of music is another complex topic that has been very much stretched and pulled in many ways by music of the 20th century, where there is a big debate as to whether this piece is music or not. I mean, things like, I don't know, Ligetti's metronome pieces, which really stretched people's limits and imagination at the time. Though I think actually listening to the symphonic poem for 1,000 metronomes is a very moving experience in many ways. If you start thinking about actually what is it about and what kind of experience is it portraying, so you'd be surprised as to where you can derive a musical experience from. But again, music is this way to express the human experience that is in so many ways a lot more universal than language, because it is a language we can all speak, especially when it comes to instrumental music. Though I could listen to a song in a language I don't speak and still be very moved by the musical content and be able to infer what the text is about in a way that perhaps listening to a poem in a language I do not speak would not be able to communicate that. So music is this extraordinary thing. And again, coming back to Schopenhauer and Nietzsche, they saw music as existing on a plane of its own, representing this world of the ideal because of its universality and its abstract nature, actually. So there's really something unique about this art form among art forms. And that is why it is such an extraordinary experience to kind of be a part of this. And so coming back to your question again, I think musicality is simply the extent to which one is able to swim in the sea, the extent to which one is really embodying what it means to translate not only the human experience, but anything about life, whatever it is that the composer had in mind, or we have in mind as creators of this sonic experience in the moment, into an experience for the listener.
That's such a great answer, and so many things to learn from that as well. And you were mentioning about quoting Schopenhauer and Nietzsche. I was thinking about Kant as well, and the critique of aesthetic judgment. And I've still yet to read the entirety of the book, but from even just even from what I've been able to gather, there was even like a debate on the whether beauty can be objective, right? And if I think, and I could be wrong on this point, someone probably should correct me if I'm wrong on this point. I think Kant argues that there's a lot of subjective notions towards what beauty is, but that's also another area of debate, even in terms of a musical or artistic, not just expression, but whether there is objectivity in music and how it can evoke a response. One of my earlier guests was Aaron Sang, who's also a composer. He teaches at the University of Toronto's Faculty of Music. In fact, he was the one who composed the graduation music for U of T's graduation ceremonies, which is still played to this day for the last, I think, 10 to 15 years, but also involved in a lot of other film compositions and all that stuff. And his argument essentially is that there is objectivity in music. And interestingly enough, he actually used a very popular video game theme from a lot of people here in America and in Japan would know, the Super Smash Bros. Melee menu theme, for example. Like once you put that music on, when you turn on that game and you hear that theme, you immediately get an emotional response to it. You're hyped up, you're ready, you're going into that game, you're ready to play your favorite Nintendo characters against whoever it may be. But that theme gets that response. And that was what his argument was when he uses that among other examples as those to express his argument of objectivity in music. But it's fascinating because that subjectivity and objectivity, that debate still kind of rages on in so many different areas. And I think also informs in many ways how different people define musicality in their own unique experiences.
Yeah, I mean, this is a very complex question. As you mentioned, Kant was an important contributor to the whole debate around aesthetics. And there has, of course, been a lot of a kind of an appeal to the physics of music to express why there are certain principles, this idea that tonality or major scales, I mean, these are things that are inherent in nature because of the overtone scale. You take a string and you pluck it, it makes a certain sound, you cut it in half, and then different fractions will create different tones. So the scales that we use are not merely arbitrary, but somehow exist in nature. And of course, then we can look at how the brain responds to different things and try to understand through a neuroscientific perspective what are the basic parameters of this kind of sonic experience, which is basically the vibration of particles that are creating certain experiences in our minds, the way we translate these vibrations into sound, which is of course very subjective as well, in the sense that we can't hear all the kinds of frequencies. Certain frequencies are too high for us, some are too low for us. So as with color, color doesn't exist objectively outside there in the world. We can see a certain band of wavelengths. So you can apply the same principles to sound as well. That being said, I mean, with something like musical character and so on, it becomes an important question. Okay, to what extent, for example, is the set of emotions you get with that music an associative one that comes through something like behavioral conditioning? Every time you play an exciting game and you hear this music, then you're creating a kind of Pavlovian association there, where that music is associated with that experience. Or, for example, the Mr. Softy, I think, theme is associated with wanting to get ice cream or something like that. So you're creating these kinds of associations. But of course, you can say that objectively certain musical parameters, a high BPM, a beat per minute, will create a sense of excitement because it's reflecting our own heart rate in the moment and the dynamic level. So of course, those things are ways to musically reflect aspects of our experience, and these things are objective in the sense that they refer to other phenomena in life, and that kind of mirror that music can play is one of the things that makes it so powerful.
Absolutely. And about these different interplays and relationships between music and also other elements as well, you would encompass a lot of that in your most recent research with the Neurorecital. In fact, as of the recording of this episode, you had just recently premiered this Neurorecital at the Verbier Festival. What is Neurorecital? And what are the most important findings that you found in your research leading up to and including the Neurorecital?
Well, so basically, this is a recital format. I came up with this kind of typically harebrained idea of many, one of many crazy ideas I get to play a concert where actually the audience can kind of see a visualization of what happens in my brain. And this visualization is created using this extraordinary technology called the glass brain. It's the most advanced visualization of neural activity. It's developed by this team based out of the University of California, San Francisco. They're called Neuroscape, and it uses EEG technology, so EEG data, so electroencephalogram imaging, and the scanning is done prior to the concert, actually. So we actually had me with this funny cap on, with all the buttons, the nodes coming off the cap, repeat recordings of this music over and over and over again. And we had a very interesting methodology that actually brought us a level of clarity in looking at the performer's brain that has never been possible before. I won't get into the technical details now, but it's resulted in a very interesting new direction in the research. But this data was recorded and then filtered and analyzed and combined to create these very clear visualizations that are then resynchronized to my live playing. So I'm not wearing the cap on stage. So you just have a projection of what's going on. And it first, as I mentioned, was a kind of artistic project. I just wanted it to be an interesting experience. It actually started as a kind of film before I thought of creating a live version of it. But then the research became very detailed and very interesting. And given the methodology, we have a very clear picture of what the brain is like depending on what it's doing. And actually, the pieces of music I play look very different. And that was really the kind of exciting part. Me playing a very slow Debussy piece like La Cathédrale Engloutie, really spacious, makes the brain look very different compared to maybe playing an equally slow piece like a quite slow Bach fugue, but the brain looks very different in the Bach because of the polyphony requiring a very different kind of mental activity to manage multiple voices. And then of course, if I'm playing quick music, my motor cortex lights up. One of the really fascinating things we saw was that when I was playing Scriabin, my occipital lobe, so something in the back of the brain that is involved with visual processing, was especially active compared to any other piece I played. And then we were wondering, Scriabin had synesthesia. And we were wondering whether somehow the music he wrote, even if unconsciously, was somehow making me think in a much more visual way than I was with any other piece I was playing, because this aspect of sound translating into color and visual feedback or stimuli could have especially, been especially present in the Scriabin, given his own kind of multisensory capacities. So it's been absolutely fascinating, and this is really just the beginning. So it'll be interesting to see where we go with this.
Yeah, and it truly is fascinating. Even just seeing some of the videos that I've seen from friends who were actually at your presentations, even seeing that, just the beginning processes of that is already like honestly, you learn so much from that. And I think this in many ways holds an empirical scientific potential of even improving overall effective musical performance. And from your experience of that, how has that improved your musical performance? And how can Neurorecital overall contribute to our current knowledge of effective musical performance?
Well, I think understanding how the brain responds to different kinds of musical challenges gives us a much clearer idea of perhaps how to practice effectively. I mean, we're quite far from that right now. We just developed the tool. We did the first kind of case study with me being the only subject. To really start understanding these things in the future, one would have to, for example, have multiple pianists play the same piece, using this methodology, and then start to see the differences across different brains, which is something we are planning to do. But one thing that is becoming very clear already in terms of the clinical application is, for example, in understanding what kinds of music stimulate different parts of the brain. And for example, if we are using music as therapy for someone who has Parkinson's or Alzheimer's or some kind of neurological condition, and thinking, okay, we need to try to stimulate this part of the brain more, which has been injured, what kinds of music, what kinds of musical activity, what kinds of challenges will target that part of the brain. So that is actually a very promising aspect of this research, really being able to simply correlate musical parameters to brain activity with a lot more precision in real time than what we've been able to do before. That really opens up a whole new kind of avenue of music therapy that is a lot more targeted than what we've had before.
Yeah, and you mentioned musical therapy. This instantly brings to mind even just the personal experience I had. This was over a decade ago. I was still in high school at the time, but I was volunteering at this geriatric care center. You were mentioning about Alzheimer's and different forms of dementia. One of the floors that we worked on, that I volunteered on, was the dementia floor. So all of these residents were advanced staged, or in their advanced stage of Alzheimer's, Parkinson's, and almost the full gamut of dementia. There was one time where I just played a video on demand of an entire concert on Medici.tv. I think it was an opera. I forgot which opera it was. Oh no, it was the Knife Stimmen competition, actually. So I just played for them just to listen to. For those of you who are not familiar with Neue Stimmen, it's an international competition for classical vocalists. And even just playing one of the arias, I forgot which aria it was, but I think it was sung by a soprano. Residents who haven't spoken a word in years spoke in their native languages, saying, "Oh, that's so beautiful." I had literally never seen them speak in the entirety, almost a year since I was working with them. I had never seen or heard them speak. So even just seeing that, like for them just to suddenly just brighten up and start talking and then just focus so much on the music. And it's something that and this is also a predominantly Chinese Canadian place of population. So many of them are most likely not familiar with more niche operas, but they just reacted. They just reacted in such a way. And I'm speaking anecdotally from this. I'm thinking, I think that's like an example of what you were just talking about with how your findings in the Neurorecital can really affect that sort of aspect.
I mean, absolutely. I mean, you see someone who cannot walk, they have Parkinson's, for example, and then you turn the music on and they walk fine. And someone cannot speak, but they can sing. So there's something about music that really rewires or changes the way in which the brain works. And absolutely, these are wonderful examples. And kind of one argument we want to make. I don't know how much you got to see from the material we had visually of my brain activity, but the whole brain lights up. I mean, it's an absolute firework of activity. And the piano is especially complex in terms of what it forces the brain to do because of the amount of coordination required. And the argument that we're trying to kind of make here is that there are a few things as good for the brain as playing music and listening to music and playing the piano. And especially when it comes to just music education or general education, there has been this slow disappearance of arts education and music education in schools, just generally speaking, because we think that we just need to spend more time on like the really, really useful things, like, everything else. But the argument I think that one has to make is that, okay, let's say you do 5 hours of maths a week. You might actually be a better mathematician if you do 1 hour of music and 4 hours of maths rather than no music and 5 hours of math, because the way in which music forces different parts of the brain to speak to each other is unlike anything else. And then you become a lot more creative and your academics get better. So, we're really looking at the effects of music on the brain in all walks of life and all stages of life. And, that research might not be something I'm intimately connected with. I mean, we were just fortunate to have basically created a new methodology for this particular project that will be very effective in studying those kinds of things. But the implications are enormous. So it will be exciting to see where this all goes.
It totally is. And you mentioned about how the gradual decrease in artistic education, especially here in Canada, in the general public school system. I've been saying this a couple of times already on previous episodes of the podcast, but that's also an example of that, where I live in Ontario, even as recent as 2016, which by this point is almost 10 years ago, my goodness, but they've already cut so much funding to the extent where some schools literally teach music on carts, and the teachers aren't even musically trained. They're homeroom teachers who may not have any kind of musical knowledge. I mean, they may not even know solfege. So how do you teach music in that sense? It's going to be very ineffective. Frankly, even before that, when we had a music department, don't get me wrong, it's important. But even back then, it was not effective in the sense that there wasn't that cultural backing. And there still isn't that cultural backing, at least here in Canada, at that level. Because here in Canada, I'm trying my best not to generalize, and because that's not the intention here, but because there isn't, or there's been a loss of that classical music cultural awareness and appreciation, many people here consider music to be, something that you just do for fun, which it is for fun, don't get me wrong, but it's more of like, I pick up a guitar, I play a couple chords, I play like the same 4-chord progression, and that's it. And it's almost stereotypical at this point, but unfortunately in some areas it's just like, that's all they think about. But it's so much more than that, right? Which is why I always admire Europe, especially Eastern Europe on this point, and also parts of Asia. Well, China, of course, has it in spades. Hong Kong as well, Japan, South Korea, Taiwan, all these different places, right? I always admire these places because they've always maintained that sort of importance. Even if you're not studying music, it's still a major part of your education. I just had a conversation with Ilya on this point. In Ukraine, similar deal, right? It's a similar deal in Ukraine where there's so much backing, there's so much support for the arts that even if you're not studying music as your main goal, you still have it in spades. You still have that awareness and emphasis and appreciation for the arts in that thing. And it's something that you just can't take for granted.
Absolutely. So our hope is that, after this decline, there will be more interest in just bringing this kind of multifaceted, well-rounded education back. It's interesting, just over the course of the 20th century, there has been this kind of movement towards specialization. We don't have polymaths anymore. We specialize within our fields, and even within those fields, we specialize in a narrow band. And we've somewhat lost the joy of interdisciplinary collaboration and cross-pollination and inspiration. I mean, the fact that the idea of a performer-composer became increasingly rare over the course of the 20th century is crazy, because if you think of anyone in previous centuries, if you performed, you composed. If you composed, you performed. You weren't one or the other. So I think it's very encouraging to see that this idea of the performer-composer is becoming increasingly, if not mainstream, at least more common. And this idea of bringing together different strands from different fields is something that is not so unusual anymore. Again, I didn't go into these other fields just for the fun of it. I mean, yes, actually, kind of just for the fun of it, but somehow it all fed back into what to do as a musician. And it wasn't arbitrary. And it all is part of this conversation I'm having with, well, what does it mean to be a musician? And the reason why the cognitive sciences were of particular interest is because this is in some way a new paradigm. If you study the way in which we have studied the mind over the past centuries. At some point, philosophy was the main way to study the mind, and we had, the era of psychology. And so if you kind of read an analysis of how we've been approaching understanding the brain, well, the cognitive sciences, and especially neuroscience and the hard scientific approach now, because of the technology we have, is kind of the new paradigm. And we have a neuro everything now. We have neuroeconomics and neuro this and neuro that. And so it's a kind of tongue-in-cheek thing. Actually, there's an element of humor in calling it the Neurorecital. It's kind of just like jokingly referring to how there's a neuro everything, and it's a really fun project that has, primarily an artistic purpose, but has also brought with it some very interesting insights. So let's see where we go with this. But we're certainly trying to make the case that, just look at the brain on music. One reason why, for example, in clinical settings or therapeutic settings, something like psychedelics has become very important is because it forces lots of the brain, many parts of the brain, to light up at the same time and speak to each other. Just look at my brain when I'm playing Bach. All of it is lighting up. You don't need mushrooms for that. You can just play Bach. So so that's kind of the point here, that it's very, very concrete evidence of the brain being like getting a full brain workout from doing this activity, playing the piano, in a way that hardly anything else can do, and that's just very gratifying to see.
And the best part is, with music, there are no negative side effects.
Right, exactly.
None whatsoever.
Exactly.
So,
yeah.
So, and throughout our entire conversation, I think you've already answered this question, like, through your own experiences. But if you could succinctly say, to answer this question, what is the complete artist to you?
Right. Well, I think the complete artist, in some way, the idea of what I consider the complete artist refers back to this question of what does musicality mean? An artist that is able to translate any aspect of the human experience and what it is to be alive and engage with the world into music. And the idea of the complete artist, as of course articulated by the competition, is an artist that draws inspiration from many places and engages with the world. So it's this very interesting kind of interplay of the input you get and what you give, what your output ends up being. An input that is very broad and all-encompassing in many ways, and an output that similarly is very broad and all-encompassing, that you engage with audiences in many different ways, in different contexts, in different settings, to really inspire a wide range of listeners and really kind of transmit what this music is about in a way that somehow really speaks to the time we live in. I think to be a complete artist means to engage with the world through this art and not be kind of stuck in a time capsule, but rather be part of the progress of this field in the world we live in.
Yeah, and what better way to see that than to see it at the Honens International Piano Competition? This is a competition that, especially in Canada and the US, for the average person, may not necessarily be familiar with in terms of a viewing experience or a listening experience. It's very different from a sports competition for sure, right? There's a lot of quantitative elements. There's a very clear goal of scoring more points than the other team or the other player in order to win that sports competition. So it would be very jarring for some new audience members who are unfamiliar with classical music and with piano competitions for them to watch Honens. So how could new audiences watch international piano competitions like Honens and get the most out of their viewing and enjoyment of these competitions?
Well, I mean, perhaps the best way is to connect directly with the music rather than the competition side of it. One advantage that you get in a competition is you get to hear a lot of the same music in the hands of different performers. And that becomes an interesting exercise. It's like hearing many different people take on the same role in a play, for example. You might have your favorite actors, for Macbeth, or Prospero, or any Shakespeare character, whatever it is. And it's the same. This Beethoven sonata in the hands of this pianist will be very different than the way another pianist approaches it. So it's an insight into the way in which we are constantly in conversation with this music. Of course, the sporting aspect is exciting. Who's going to make it to the next round? Who is going to win? Who's going to get, the silver and bronze medals and so on and so forth. But these are extraordinary young pianists that are giving this music their all. And you get a great variety of what you get to listen to. So perhaps the first place is to listen with a curious, open mind. Just be receptive and start to notice, what is it, if you're new to this, what is it that moves you? You'll find some favorites, certain types of pieces, certain composers that speak to you, others might not. Some pianists' approaches might speak to you more than that of others. So it's a nice buffet. I think when you go to one concert, you get a certain kind of set meal. But, in a competition, you can dip your toes in and try out many different things as a listener and really be mindful and observe the way in which you respond. And have a conversation with your own instincts about this. It's very subjective. You might not agree with the jury's decisions, but that's the beauty of this thing. It speaks to us in different ways, and you will discover many great artists that you might want to follow and then hear when they come to your town and play a concert. So it's just a wonderful kind of celebration of the art of the piano. And I hope that the listeners will tune into this very special occasion happening in Calgary in October of this year.
Yeah, and I look forward to doing that as well, and to promoting Honens in whatever way I can possibly do. As we get to the end of this episode, or close to the end of this episode, what are the most rewarding aspects of your career so far, and the most important lessons that you've learned in your career that you would want to pass on to those as advice who want to pursue a career in classical music?
Well, something I often say is that, of course, some of the peak experiences are playing in massive sold-out halls with, great orchestras and all that. But perhaps some of the most memorable and gratifying experiences are also, just playing for a small group of people and having very direct conversations with those listeners on how one's performance or these pieces have moved them, influenced them, what their thoughts were. It's really a constant engagement with one's listener. Again, you're not in a bubble. It's a constant dialogue, and getting to engage with these audiences is always such a pleasure. And just simply being able to spend each day performing, interpreting, channeling some of the greatest music ever written is just such a great privilege. So, I think the joy of a soloist career as a pianist is just the sheer range of contexts in which you can share music. And, the advice I would give to any young aspiring musician is to really find one's personal path, actually. And we will all have different approaches and different inclinations. And it's important to feel like this is the best way in which you can express who you are. I think if you don't have that conviction, it'll be very hard to manage all the difficulties that come with this career, because it's not a comfortable process. It's a very difficult process. It's an extremely challenging process. I often feel like there's no job more difficult than being a pianist. Like, honestly, the kind of pressure and the intensity is really unlike anything that I'm familiar with. It's comparable to other musical and artistic disciplines as a performing artist, but there's something really especially challenging about this. So one has to really feel like, actually, this is the only way in which one can fully be what one wants to be in life. And if you have that, then everything else falls away, and all those other distractions and difficulties and challenges become just, hardly a scratch on the joy it is to live this musical life.
Some great advice to end on. And Nico, thank you so much for coming on the show. Your research has broken so much important ground into the world of music and performance, and even your career, your musical performing career and composing career also speaks for itself as well as a legendary pathway as well. Thank you so much for sharing your experiences. You're always welcome to come back on again at some point in the future. to share more of your experiences and also with new updates to your research. And again, thank you so much for sharing the living legend of Nicolas Namoradze.
Thank you so much. It's been a great pleasure. And yes, I look forward to continuing this conversation.
And thank you to those in the audience who have tuned in to this episode of The Living Legend of Nicolas Namoradze. You can follow him on Instagram at Nicolas Namoradze and also on his website, nicolasnamoradze.com. You can also follow the Honens YouTube channel at Honens Official, as well as at Honens on any of the official social media platforms as well. Also, you can also tune into his Neurorecital. You can also look at the findings that he has found. Again, the Neurorecital, fascinating first step in groundbreaking research into the effects of musical performance on a person's brain. So be sure to stay tuned for that. And again, the Honens International Piano Competition, the 2025 edition, will begin on October 15th. That's the semi-finals of the competition, and will run until almost the end of October. So those 2 weeks are certainly 2 weeks that you do not want to miss. You can also follow us on our social media at This Is the Legend Of on Instagram, as well as for zondoing the like button, subscribing to the YouTube channel, and clicking on the bell notification icon, so you will always be there and be notified whenever we upload, as well as following us on our audio platforms, Spotify, Apple Podcasts, Amazon Music, iHeartRadio, and wherever you get your podcasts. Also on our website, we have all the episodes there. You can also donate to us on our PayPal. The website is thisisthelegendof.com. So once again, thank you so much for tuning in. Signing off for now, this is Amos Vang. Stay safe, stay healthy, and stay legendary.